Hello and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Nasty. In today's episode, we're going to be covering the second part of this mini-series where I'm talking through how I've scaled the base to get to 2.5 million effective science per minute, running all the sciences across all the different planets for research productivity. So, first off, you're going to notice that I'm not running research productivity, so I'm running mining productivity. And you'll probably be wondering why. So, the reason for that is I have talked about in the last episode that I redesigned Vulcanus, and I am currently testing out a new build that I have there. So we'll cover that here in a second, but the mining productivity has a key component for why I am currently cranking on mining productivity to make Vulcanus better. The second part that I want to talk through in this particular episode is about Nauvis and the specific transition when you go into research productivity, and how I've completely eliminated the token system for the planet or the ships that actually go to the solar system edge and beyond. So I'll talk through that and a couple different redesigns on Nauvis. I've redesigned Gray Science, so I'll talk through that shortly. And I've also redesigned Yellow Science, which I will also talk about. The Yellow Science isn't fully stable, and it's very similar to my previous build, so mainly I'm trying to explain some of the problems that you'll wind up having with this, no matter what quality you have, but just some different design choices that exist there. And then ultimately, holistically, how I wind up shutting off half the base when I'm running research productivity, which I'll cover here in a second as well. So stay tuned, and we'll get right into the video. So this is Vulcanus before I did the redesign. You're going to notice that there is a kind of absurd number of rocket silos that are here. And as this particular ship comes over Vulcanus, you're going to wind up seeing them all launch in one go. The core concept for why I did this was just to minimize the downtime and being able to launch all these rockets at one time. I think it's cool to see this many rockets all firing at once, for sure. But it's definitely overkill. I don't need quite this amount of throughput for these number of rocket silos. You're also noticing the swarm of bots that go to all of the different silos to fill them all up. And you wind up seeing here that what we're wind up actually requesting here is 384,000, which is 4 launches of, if I can do the math here, how many rocket silos we have. 192, so I guess 2 launches of 192 rocket silos. This is just kind of overkill, or drastically overkill. These 2 should be enough just to launch this out of here, and you're seeing that there's also just a lot of inserters that are just daisy-chained here to just quickly fill this up, and then fill up the next one. And, ultimately, I don't like the way that I've designed this. There's a lot of just wakelets that are turning on and off all the time. The belts are not really properly tuned here because I don't quite consume a full 240 coming here, so there's kind of... In other words, although this can technically produce here enough for, it's an odd number, is where I'm kind of coming from. There's 169 per second or so, and it can't quite even do that because it'll turn on and off occasionally. It's using individual lead followers, so a lot of circuit control for everything. So, overall, I wanted to completely redesign this. I'm probably going to keep this section and slightly redesign it just to have a continuous clock for everything, but this is perfect for the amount of actual fluids that I wind up needing here. So this ultimately doesn't have to change, but I want to eliminate the bot usage. I have this very overkill rocket factory that sits here. I'm not going to remove this at all. I'll just keep it, but instead I'll just belt the materials to the actual silos that need to go out there. Additionally, one of the things that I have here is I have an overkill number of lanes. We have 24 of them, and I really just need 5 for every 240, so really I can cut down on 4 lanes here. And that means that, here, this kind of works because I wind up adding, a speed beacon, so that this is slightly faster, which is what you're going to wind up needing to actually produce the tungsten, because one of the things you got to think about with tungsten is that its mining time is 500%. So compared to iron ore, which is at 100%, just normal, and you also see, for example, uranium is 200%, but then this being 500% means that it is 500 or 5 times slower to actually mine anything from tungsten. So for this whole voiding technique, you wind up needing significantly higher mining productivity in order to get a break-even point where you don't need speed beacons anymore, or any more beacons with any speed module in them. And specifically, if we're talking about that, let's go and I will open up here this specific chart. This is from a video that I created a long time ago where I brute force computed all of the individual values that you would need at a specific mining productivity level for like how many number of miners you're going to need in order to mine tungsten ore and get a target of 60 or 240 per second. So if we're looking at this here, you're seeing that there's a very magic mining productivity level, which is 26,658, where you can get a clean 240 of Q2 tungsten ore, and you have to void the minimum amount in order to do that. So that's my current goal, is behind the scenes to get the base to the point where I can hit this magic 26,658 so that I can run these normal optimized voiding setups without having any speed beacons. Because right now, let's go bring this up here just so we can look at that. If we don't have these speed beacons here, you wind up seeing this produces 804 per second. Well, based on that chart, we need to be voiding here a total of 826.68 per second plus 240. So that means that in total, that's 240 plus 826. So this needs to be at least at 1066 per second, and we are not there. So this is the older version before I started actually cranking on mining productivity. You'll see here I'm at a measly 20,111. So I've gotten 4,000 extra levels since then, but I'm not quite there yet, so I will talk through the new design now, and I'll talk through some of the compromises I made so I can still run it. And with using effectively like the least amount of speed increase as I possibly can. So take this into consideration here. Here's the old setup and the old factory and the way that it looked. And then we'll transition now over to the new setup, and you'll see just how much smaller it winds up actually being. So this is the new setup for Vulcanus. You're going to notice immediately that there's a significantly less real estate that is being taken up here. There's some new belts that come down here. That's for the rocket part delivery. I'm using the exact same setup that I had before. This is something I designed a while ago. It's very overkill for the actual amount of actual rocket parts that I'm going to wind up needing, but I don't feel like actually changing it. So we're just going to keep the exact same setup that we had here already previously. So what I'm doing now is I'm belting all the rocket materials, and then those go into the individual silos here. One of the things that I am doing right now in order to continue to test this is I'm currently dumping all of the science. I'm just traveling between Nauvis and Vulcanus, and then I wind up just simulating the consumption of it by just dumping it into space. So the tests, and that's mainly also just so I can demonstrate it here because I'm not running research prod quite yet, although we will in a second. So the main core differences of this new design is that we are now just having 2 silos per individual foundry. The beaconing is much higher, so this is going to go to 50 per second, although I am throttling it using clocks here to go down to 48 per second. And 48 per second times 5 is going to get you to the magic number of 240 per second. So slightly underclocking the actual builds, but it also makes it pretty nice from a back pressure standpoint. So that means that I can run one dedicated belt to 2 of these individual foundries. And so you're going to notice here that when I had mentioned a second ago that I was running 24 lanes, well, we brought that down now to 20. And a very nice even split. So you wind up having one with one splitter that happens to exist here, just to split them between this section and this section. But the consumption rate's kind of nice because we're pulling from this side of the inside of the belt, and then this is pulling from the outside lane of the belt. So there's more or less, it's not exactly perfectly distributed, and because it's not perfectly distributed, I can't actually set the output priority here. That means that it needs to split evenly between the two sides. But for more or less the convenient part about all of this is that now we have a very new build that leverages now a lot more beaconing, and technically you could get even more beaconing around this. I just decided to go for a 10 beacon setup because that's plenty. If you go a little bit higher, you could potentially make the argument that instead of doing 5 and 5 for 480, you could potentially do a 4-4 plus 1, so 9 of these for 480 per second. I've kind of found over time, just myself, the way that I wind up designing things is that if I need to add a whole bunch of extra beacons and complexity to get to the point where I have that, like, one breakpoint of having one extra science assembler, usually it just doesn't wind up being worth it. And that's very subjective. That's not always going to be the case, but that's just something that I have personally kind of found in my design philosophy. So I don't go for the breakpoint of having like a non-even distribution between sides, because the logic and the complexity goes significantly higher when you don't have a divisible by 2 number of actual science assemblers. So, because like in the end, the amount of transfers are going to be the exact same in terms of the throughput, but with reducing the number of entities you wind up needing, which can be better, but in general, it winds up being that, like, okay, let's say we had, instead of these 10 here, we had 9, right? Well, then one of these cryogenic plants are going to have to be dedicated to just one of these buildings and one of these buildings, right? So whether it really winds up being useful, I don't know. The main benefit that I wind up having here, and that's a huge side tangent aside, these pods are significantly smaller than they used to be. So now we're kind of in a nice scenario where the number of rockets that we're actually needing to use here is we've jumped down to only 80 silos that we're actually going to be using at any point in time, compared to the 196 rocket silos that we had. And this is plenty for the actual throughput. You buffer in this particular car here, this is what we're doing, and the car is what is then going to these 2 different inserters that are then going to feed these 2 individual rocket silos. And if you run this at full speed, this will eventually be able to throw these items into space faster than this science assembler could actually keep up. So this is plenty for the actual throughput that we have here. And then otherwise, yeah, the clocks here are all generated by the clock generator that I've demonstrated in the past. Just as a quick side tangent, I have a clock generator sidecar mod now that I have created, and you can hover over the entities that are in a build, and it will wind up extracting all of the wonderful info that you wind up needing, and you can copy that and paste it directly into the clock generator so that you can use it. So that way you don't have to go and list very manually every single one of the inserters, and it can go and do the simulation for you. Been having a lot of success about using the clock generator in a lot of these kind of quirky builds where you're kind of touching things and slightly adjusting when this inserter is going to be inserting into this machine versus this machine, and it's been working out pretty good so far. So this is the new setup. Drastically smaller. The main core concept now, because we have reduced the number of belts that we have, is that now that also means that the assemblers, or the actual upcyclers, can be drastically reduced up here as well. So if we look now at these setups here, you can see there's a lot more beacons, and the main reason for that is I'm trying to compromise, because right now I don't have the 2,000 extra mining productivity that I wind up needing. So the idea that I have now is I will reduce the actual effect that this one speed beacon has by adding up to 5 beacons around these mining drills. Now that still is over the amount that we need, because we said in the past we needed 1,066 per second. This is 1,600 per second. So this is still too fast, and I need it. So in order to compensate for that, what I'm doing right now is I will occasionally use this extra inserter, which is usually just dedicated for higher quality materials to pull out of here. I wind up using this to send occasionally a normal quality tungsten ore to get through the amount that we actually need to void here. So because we would You can get away with a total of 7 inserters when you're... Well, you can get away with 7 inserters once you're at the magic no speed beacons anymore. But you're going to need 8 at least for at least the mining productivity I have and this speed beacon configuration. So this is all controlled by one master clock now here, so that's very different. Everything before was wake lists. So, and this may look really complicated, but the main thing that just exists here is I'm checking for a signal from all of the 4 blades. So these 4 blades down here all wind up going and emitting a signal whenever this particular machine stops crafting, because we can't output anything anymore into this car. Then this will go and say, hey, I'm over the limit, I'm output blocked here, and working is equal to 0. So, and that just is 25 here is not a magic number, very specific number, which is the overload multiplier that you see over there, which is 25. So that means that, hey, we are output blocked because our signal is, we are not working, so this particular foundry is now in a spot where it has stopped producing anything. We can go and emit our moon signal, which is going to be, hey, we are now dormant, we're sleeping. And then just to separate the signals, this is kind of just a no-op, it winds up just sending that signal across, and all of those individual blades all come with red wires up here. And you see here, this comes also across from this side and this side. And what happens then is that red wire comes all the way up here, and it winds up saying, hey, if all 4 of them are currently sleeping, go ahead and start a timer. And whenever we are sleeping for 30 seconds, then go ahead and disable all the clocks. So it just sends a signal to disable all of these cider combinators that have clocks for voiding and turning on and off the recyclers, and also all the arithmetic combinators, so that the clock value here, which is 1, winds up then getting combined with this -1 here, so that it's 0, and then all of the arithmetic combinators stop in place. So that is convenient, because then we don't have all of these constantly turning on and off with the clocks to turn, effectively to go and turn on the recyclers, and you just have a constant number of signals going across here. Then this is completely shut down. Those signals then get propagated over here, so there's just one clock that feeds all of these different mining setups. So you can see here, this is all completely shut down while we're not actually actively using it, and we're simulating the consumption right now, but really, this whole entire setup, if I was just targeting research productivity, could just be this, because that's the actual amount of speed that you wind up needing for 120-second research. So that's going to be 960 per second. But I'm going for a full 1920. Let's see if I did the math there right. Cool. So I'm doing 1920, and the reason I'm doing that is because if I ever, for some reason, want to increase my artillery shooting speed or my shell damage or any of those kind of things, I still want to be able to say that I can go and run those at full speed, and that's what this whole setup is here for. So, otherwise, to talk a little bit about the fluid setup, it's remained mostly unchanged. The main difference is that because the fluids are all going to be outputting at the same rate, you'll notice here that this is 30, 31. These are like very, very close in terms of the stone outputs. And you're also going to see that the calcite is hovering around this automated insertion limit of 13. So all I'm doing here is, this is a really simple lead follower setup. This just monitors this one individual foundry, and it just goes and reads the contents included also in crafting, and this just winds up saying, hey, whenever calcite is less than than 6, which is just arbitrarily chose that, as long as it's under the automated insertion limit, I just divided it by 2. That way, if one of them is slightly over or slightly under, this will always be constantly outputting it at a lower amount. It doesn't matter. They're all going to get consumed at the same time, so the main goal is just to choose a number that's under the automated insertion limit, so that one of the foundries is going to lead all the rest of them. And then otherwise, I also void all of the stone, and that just kind of clocks it pretty easily. It's just like, hey, whenever it's greater than 32, grab all these inserters and throw them into landfill. The landfill compresses it at a 50-to-1 ratio, and then just occasionally we'll go and throw that landfill into recycler, which then instantly voids it into the lava. I don't really know if this is actually better than just doing something like this. And we'll bring these over here because I don't really have any construction in this area. This might be sufficient, but kind of lava in itself is the way that the animation time works for a stack inserter is voiding something into lava is the same as putting a belt directly in front of it, because it takes 4 ticks to go and unload it, because it's 1 tick per stack of 4 items. So this is then an instant transfer, that was the idea here, into this particular recycler. So, and then that reduces it by 25%. This thing barely ever runs. I don't know if this is better or not, but the point is here that only 25% of this is getting unloaded to a quote-unquote belt here, because that's kind of how this is simulated behind the scenes in terms of animation time. This instantly destroys it, so in theory, that is potentially better, although I've never actually tested it. But that's kind of the way that I'm setting this up, is as much direct insertion as possible to get rid of the stone, because it is quite an amount of stone that actually gets generated here whenever this is running. So I've set that up, so then this is one giant pod here, and here we can actually see it running. This will actually turn on and off, and this is because we are latching this to keep a certain amount of buffer in this range here. You'll see once this all kicks off and starts running at 100% speed, we're going to drop under the amount that we've latched to on the decider combinator, and that's going to issue a signal for all of these to turn on. So, and you'll notice then also that all of these inserters are all kind of acting together to remove all of the stone from here. And so, effectively, the reason that that's so useful is that, like, when I have right now Wakeless turned on, they're very occasionally having an extra flicker, and that's just to overcome, have like one of these inserters to hold in hand a buffer occasionally. And this is enough to get the throughput that I wind up needing while only using one of the actual foundries as the lead. So there's no real clock going on here, because it's kind of annoying to clock this otherwise. Because, like, you're going to run into the fluid output kind of restrictions here, because you can only really evict 100 fluid per tick from each of these different ports, so it's 200 per tick. So you wind up getting occasionally where this winds up getting output full, and you'll see that, and it's not output full on stone, it's actually output full on molten copper. So, which is fine, it just winds up being kind of like a really annoying thing to clock, so just using a very simple lead follower setup here to just kind of occasionally bring in calcite and to like remove stone, you're going to see here that they just wind up clocking, turning on and off, just occasionally pulling all the stone out. So that's how I've done it, and then there's 2 independent banks, 2 different fluid banks here, so all these are controlled independently, and these are controlled independently. And then otherwise here, you can start seeing the whole entire build come alive here. We got all the tungsten ore coming in, and this extra little excess getting rid of the tungsten ore is not exactly perfect. We occasionally will back up, but for me right now running research productivity, this is perfect, because this is like plenty enough of a buffer to kind of hold over and just barely hang on as we are trying to go and produce all that we need. And you can see here we stop. All of the stuff gets eliminated, all the extra stuff here, and then we wind up completely going dormant here in a second. So this was working right now, so for that reason, what I'm going to do now is I'll show the transition to research productivity, and then we'll let the whole build run for real now. So let's get rid of all of these inserters here, and then we can go ahead and switch over. So I'll see you there in a second. So the first thing that you're going to notice that's now different about my base is all my Promethium ships are currently hovering over Nauvis. In the past, all of them except for one would be sitting over Aquilo. And the reason is because on Aquilo, I used to have an epic barrel that I would wind up requesting, and there was only one epic barrel in the entirety of the in the entire world. So I only ever produced one, and I had just one floating around. So the idea behind that was, and this is the remnants of that silo, I used to go and bring that epic barrel, convert it from the fluid basically that was in it, which is a crude oil barrel, and I'd make it a normal barrel here on Nauvis, and I would launch that up. And that was kind of the bathroom key that I would use for each of these ships to know, hey, I currently have the token, so I can request something from the planet's surface. Now, I've done away with that mechanism altogether. And now I still have a signal that I wind up sending down to the planet, which is this barrel here. Whenever we're always going to be constantly requesting biter eggs. That's not going to ever stop, because whenever you get over the planet, you're going to be requesting that. However, when I wind up actually, you'll notice that there's one legendary barrel in here. So what happens is, whenever these Promethium science packs go below 10,000, I wind up emitting a barrel signal here, which will set the filter on this long-handed inserter. That's going to go and put it onto this belt here. Now, this will only bring this barrel back once Nauvis is not the current planet that we're hovering over. So whenever you have a number of 3 for the Nauvis signal, that's going to mean that we are currently traveling from and to this planet. That means we're currently on, right? So this enables a signal to tell right now Nauvis that, hey, I need eggs. Now, the reason that this is actually winds up now working without this token system altogether is that the way that the game works now is that any ship is in the order in which they arrive at the planet and their requests are initiated. It'll be the first in to first out. That's how the rocket silos will prioritize something. So on Nauvis, because I have exactly 256 rocket silos that can deliver 1,000 biter eggs each, what winds up happening then from that is that I can request in one shot all of the biter eggs to go and get sent up to the actual Promethium ship in one go. Now, this becomes a problem though, even though yes, I can deliver it immediately to the first one. I have to be careful that I don't go and try to send and slowly buffer and craft all of the actual captive biter spawners, like the actual eggs that I need, slowly over time, and start slowly sending rockets up into space, because that'll be not as good for freshness. So what I wind up doing is pretty simple here. I wind up having this timer here, which is pretty large at the moment. But what this winds up doing is it winds up saying, hey, right now, when was the last time I launched a rocket? Which is actually pretty easy to tell, because I just read currently the hand contents of this one bulk inserter. And whenever it winds up having any value, that means that we just launched a rocket. So that just starts a timer, and that just says, hey, as long as the amount of time is greater than I need to produce eggs in every single one of these captive biter spawners, then I create a green signal here, which just basically says, hey, I'm ready to go and launch. So the silos are ready. Now, here's where I actually create an interdelay that's a little bit larger. So I actually want to space out my Promethium ships 6 minutes apart. And that's because of the consumption rate that I have here on Nauvis. So I want them to only launch every 6 minutes at maximum. So even though like this first one will wind up getting all the eggs, it will take 6 more minutes for this one, 12 more minutes for that one, 18, 24, 30 minutes until this one winds up actually going and launching and taking off from Nauvis. The problem though that you wind up having is that they are going to, even though the things that you send from a planet is going to be first in, first out, so they'll prioritize the first ship, that's not how the drop mechanic works at all. So when they're dropping science from these different ones, and we can wind up seeing whichever one was the actual first one that arrived here by checking the amount of science that's currently in here. So you see these are all 766k. I'm assuming this one, yeah, this one's 128k. So I want this one to take off first, but all of these ships are going to be slowly trickling down Promethium science. So what I do, and we'll kick this off by actually switching over to research productivity over here. Let's transition over. Let's turn on Research Prod. And you're going to notice that all of a sudden, the request for Promethium science skyrockets to 12 million. That what happens now is every single one of the ships are going to dump all of their Promethium science in one giant, huge swarm like this. And you're seeing just by the absolute raining of Promethium science coming down here. So every single ship just dumped all of their Promethium science. And this means that now every single ship is currently completely free to wind up receiving eggs. I simply do this by, and we'll go over here to the actual setup for this. I just wind up just detecting here, hey, whenever my main lab setup over here, and give it a second for it to fully normalize. This is a, there we go. Whenever we have detected that we are currently running Promethium science, it starts a timer, and it says, hey, whenever Promethium science is currently under the consumption rate, or sorry, not consumption rate, let me find this thing in here somewhere. Okay, whenever the master, the main control network, the main clock that controls all the labs has detected that Promethium science is currently running, we start a timer, and it just starts counting up for how long we've been running Research Prod. Well, as long as this is under 30 seconds, in other words, so 18,000 ticks, it's going to wind up requesting 10 million Promethium science extra. That signal gets combined, and because I wind up setting the requests here, this ensures here that I wind up taking all of the buffer from all of the different ships that happen to be above and throwing them all immediately into the hub. So what that means is that you can already see this ship has immediately took off at the moment that we started research productivity. Now, the next ship won't be able to launch, and we'll go over to the actual launch control network, until it's been 6 minutes since we've launched the last time. This is slowly going to count up. You can see this is red right now. We're kind of waiting. So this is telling us, hey, there's a launch delay. We're waiting right now for the ender delay to be satisfied. And then here is the eggs are requested. So we can tell that right now we have 1.2 million eggs that are being requested across all of these different ships. But we are waiting now until we actually can launch, which is to create that ender delay between the individual rocket launches. So now, once those 6 minutes are up, we'll get one more green signal, and as long as the green signals are greater than or equal to 2, and here's some other mechanisms that I have just to basically say, hey, this is a way for you to disable them, just in case I want to do some maintenance or something like that. But anyway, so this is all just like a fallback mechanism, so I can turn off the launches if I don't want to actually use it. But in general, once we have a request and we've been over this amount of time and we have currently a barrel that's greater than 0, that means all of them don't have any science in them, then we can go ahead and launch the next batch. So, and this is just for convenience here, this just tells me the last time since I've launched. So it was 2 minutes and 57 seconds ago, so we'll wait until we get to the 6 minute mark, and then all of those will launch. So, while all those ships are going out into the field, let's go and talk about some ways that I have optimized things for research productivity. So, one of the things that I've done now is, because I have a master setup here that tells me very conveniently here on this little red wire every science that I am currently consuming and that I'm running at the moment. Because that is available to us, what that means is that I can wind up going and saying, cool, I know when I'm consuming or not consuming a certain science. And because 6 of the sciences are here on Nauvis, that means we can do some really cool stuff. So we can hook it up to this radar. And the radar is now a very long signal that connects all of the other radars together. So we'll talk about first what I'm doing on the input side. So we talked about this, and I may have mentioned in the previous video, but for completeness, we'll talk about it. Whenever research productivity is detected, so again, we have that red network that's coming across, that means we're going to turn off every other lane because we'll only be consuming at half the speed. Now, these are very carefully set up to go all the way back to the individual science that's actually going to be making that lane. So I've very carefully routed these belts here. And this is mainly for transport belt or transport optimization. So if I look up transport lines, for example, we'll turn off the gaps and I turn on this, you're going to see that like whenever these are currently all active here, but all of the individual lanes here are completely turned off. White means that it's inactive and blue means that it's currently active. And you'll see that every other one is currently active across these different lines. And that's very intentional because then we don't need all of the different transport lines constantly active when we're only consuming at half the speed. So that all works by going back to the individual science assembly machines and turning them on and off. So let's talk with chemical science because it's one of the best examples of this. So with chemical science, one of the things that I'm doing is I've got the Promethium science pack here that winds up coming on a signal, and this gives a weight signal. This actually, there's one clock here for the entire science assembly here, and whenever this weight signal is greater than 1, it's going to turn off this clock. So what that actually means is this whole bank here on the right-hand side is right now completely shut down. Even though there's science on the lanes, you're going to notice I've very intentionally woven these in, because these lanes are currently the only lanes that are active, and these are completely shut down. And that's so that I can turn off completely half of this whole build just using circuits. So that weight signal comes across as radar, and it goes to any of the clocks that actually control this, and we only have one clock here that controls this whole bank, and then we have another clock here, down here, that controls the red circuit production. So that's one way that I am currently telling very specifically this whole bank to shut down. I'm doing the same thing for green science and for red science, where they wind up shutting down half their lanes when they're not in use, so that we can wind up completely shutting down those systems. I haven't quite done it for military science yet, and as this is a brand new setup, but in general, you'll still see some of these clocks here are fluctuating. So let's go and turn off the transport lanes. So ideally what I'd like to do is shut down this whole entire setup and shut down this whole entire setup because they are not currently running. So I can optimize that by just not sending the signals over, but I just haven't quite done it yet. But in general, that same mechanism works everywhere. So I wind up here detecting, hey, we're actually running military science right now. So let's go and turn on our clock, which controls our entire new military setup here. So it's kind of convenient because, like, when I was just running research or mining productivity, this whole thing can be shut down and we can turn off all the circuits to it. And you can go even further and use that same kind of concept to turn off the actual clocks that are going to all of the individual upcyclers and all of those things, right? So ideally, I will continue to optimize this so that I can get it to the point where maybe just this one bank is running, because you can see like half of this is running versus the other half, and then shutting them down by evenly distributing them. But there's lots of like small little things you can do using that core concept that's really, really convenient. So using radars is super powerful, along with having a dedicated network on the radar that tells you what sciences are currently running, because you can really, like, if you think about it, there's all these 6 sciences here, and you for free can turn off complete builds if you're not actually running that science. That's a really nice little optimization that you can make. So in all of these, what I wind up doing is I just wind up starting a timer, and this is so that you can get to the point where you fully always guarantee you're saturating the build. So in all of these different cases, what I wind up doing is I wait, like, in this case, 1800 ticks, so 30 seconds, and then I'm saying, okay, we haven't used military science for 30 seconds. All right, we can completely shut down. We're no longer going to be needed. So having a little inner delay is also a good thing. You don't want it to be instantly turning off, because then you wind up getting small little gaps on the belt, which you don't really want. But that is a core concept of sending signals around so that the entirety of the base can actually shut down individual subsections and turn on and turn off individual sciences when it's not in use. So let's talk a little bit about utility science, because I finally got this new setup to be stable, but man, it is an absolute wild pain. So let me talk through that here. So the reason that this setup here is so incredibly annoying is because no matter what you do, you're going to have a problem when you are trying to insert the same ingredient with stack inserters from 2 sides of the belt. This is a theoretical thing that does work, and it's actually really, really convenient to wind up inputting the low density structures at 2 times the amount that compared to everything else. Because if you look at this, right, we're consuming low density structures at 3 of the ingredients, right? So in other words, what you can do is the inserter that is going to be inserting processing units is going to always do a double swing of LDS and then blue circuits. The flying robot frame is going to do one time a swing of LDS, and then the next time it'll do a double swing of both LDS and then flying robot frames. This, by nature, is incredibly unstable, because if you ever get to a point where this inserter gets stuck holding LDS in hand, you will never ever recover from that. So the reason why we're doing this is so we can get 3 swings of utility science out from this individual machine. And that's really nice because this keeps it as a very simple clock to turn on and off these inserters so that they're active for the minimum amount of time to actually bring the items in. So the way that I've compensated for all of this is now I look at these belts here, and this is actually what's made this whole thing stable, is I wind up checking that, hey, whenever this is greater than 160, we're going to go and turn off this locking mechanism. We're actually going to turn off the whole system. Now, I also have a second thing here, which is checking that the clock is equal to 1, or is equal to 0 again. This way, the entire build is constantly going to go through a full clock cycle all the way through and build all of the different items that it's going to need. And it will never get stuck because this winds up just checking like, hey, we're over 160 and our clock is going to be back at its 0 case. We can shut down the build. Now, this also will occasionally actually naturally happen because I'm not running a full 240 per second. I'm running 239 point and change that I wind up actually consuming from each of these individual belts. And that's just because I wanted constant back pressure. So this is also a back pressure mechanism that will actually shut down the whole build for a few seconds and allow these, in the case of this ever fully backs up. This way, these, when they actually are dormant, so you'll see that over here on this side, this is shut down so that, in essence, the actual items that are the low density structures here are going to be in a spot where they have at least 16 or they have nothing in them. And that's kind of how you want this to be set up. I know this is overly complicated. What I'm effectively just trying to say here is that this mechanism for the way that I've clocked this is just not stable by nature. And if you are designing a utility science in general, you're going to have a lot of these problems. And I just wanted to talk through, these are just some of the ways that I've dealt with that issue. And it's actually been working finally now after a while. Utility science as a whole hasn't changed much. The main difference is now I have actual proper clocking on all of the furnaces. I have just the number of furnaces that I actually wind up needing here to actually produce the raw materials that I wind up needing with a slight amount of back pressure. And this is, so in other words, I've reduced the number of entities drastically that I wind up needing. I hate this layout because it's ultra wide for producing the science here, when in reality I could probably squash this a lot more. I just didn't want to change too much the original design that I had. The big difference now, though, is that I have a dedicated LDS assembly machine, which is perfectly clocked to produce exactly 240 LDS per second. And it's actually really complicated to get LDS in a good spot because it's going to constantly get locked out, and you're going to wind up having these situations where you will have too much plastic in here. So to compensate for that, one of the simplest ways that I've gotten around a lot of my LDS headaches, because I couldn't get this to be stably clocked, is that, like, in general, you're going to notice here that the fluid inputs here are not enough. You're just not going to, quote, get the amount of... you're not going to get the throughput that you actually wind up needing on just one of these individual pipes. You can see here it needs 4.2K per second, right? So you're going to constantly see that it's under the amount that we actually need for molten copper. So in reality, going and setting these inserters at the full stack 16 actually introduces more starts and stops that ultimately makes it unstable. So the way that I currently just do this, very simply, is I just have a buffer chest here that winds up holding the amount of plastic that we wind up needing here for short bursts. This is still set to stack size 16, but the input inserters are both set to stack size 15. And what this allows you then to do is to dump in a very short succession 30 plastic bars and in a very short amount of time. And that allows you to slightly underclock the low density structure and get around the molten fluid that is constantly not consuming enough in this particular build. So by doing this, that actually means that you see here that right now, even though we have this turned on, this has no wake lists at all and is always grabbing 16 items perfectly out of here. Again, this is using the clock generator to come up with all these cool concepts. So, another really useful application of that. But yeah, so now we can get a full 240 out of just 4 of these. So each of these producing 60 per second perfectly, which is pretty cool. Otherwise, everything else is exactly the same. I'm not a huge fan of this blue circuit assembly, but it works for now. So that is utility science and how it's been redesigned. Let's go through now while I'm waiting for some of these machines to actually normalize. Let's talk about military science, because this received a very heavy redesign, and I want to talk a little bit through some of the core concepts of what I wanted to change. And I'm probably going to change a lot of the ways that people actually traditionally think about this. And let's cover that here in a second, and I'll go in the editor so that I can explain that. So, one of the very first videos I ever created on this channel was redesigning military science, which is here right now. So, at the time, I wanted to mess around a lot more with rocket silos and transporting items. And this has been slightly optimized since that last video, and actually going using the clock generator to turn on and off these inserters based on when they're actually going to be needed across here. But one of the things that is kind of a bait when it comes to military science is you wind up looking at one of these assembly machines and you wind up going like, oh, I can produce all of the walls that I'll ever need. I'm just going to need to go and shove 460 stone bricks per second into here, which you can kind of do, right? You can get the 360 items per second, which will get you the 60 that you wind up actually needing across this, right? So that's actually is going to be enough, but the problem is, like, well, what do? Do you belt them in? You wind up going and bringing them from, like in this case, that's why I was trying to go and use rocket silos for this, to go and bring all the actual stone bricks over to feed these two, because you can really, like, minimize the number of assembly machines. However, like, in reality, if you look at, like, the thing that's being consumed the most, it's going to be walls that are going into here. So traditionally, when I think about, like, a design, one of the things that I wind up going and challenging is like, hey, if I'm looking at this, whatever is going to be the higher throughput item, I should go and direct insert that. Conveniently, though, a lot of people will wind up going and saying, well, I should directly insert grenades. And the reason they say that is because, well, look at the ratios here. This can produce about 8 per second, and I can directly insert into here, and that's over the 6 per second that I'm going to need. So I might as well just direct insert this. However, really, at the ratio of what you're consuming exactly evenly grenades and piercing rounds magazines, right? And 2 times that is the wall. So you're kind of, because the convenient nature of these two recipes lining up in terms of their crafting speed, doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be better for UPS. And it actually presents another problem, is getting enough beacons around the actual machine, and so that it doesn't kind of get into this scenario where it gets output blocked at 12. Or 14 in this case. You'll never get it to reach a full 16, especially with just one inserter going into it. So you kind of start getting into a scenario where it can't actually craft high enough for you to grab 16 items at a time. So that means that these are going to actually start and stop occasionally, which actually presents a kind of a nightmare for clocking. So one of the things that I wound up saying was like, let's ignore this. Let's go and optimize for the thing that has the highest amount of insertion into the actual science assembly machine, which is going to be the actual walls. And walls are convenient because they can stack up really, really high. So there's not going to be an issue there. And the automated insertion limit is so incredibly low, so incredibly high, that you'll never have a problem with, like, throwing items actually into the machine. So what I've done is I said, I'm going to completely reapproach this. I'm going to flip this around, and I'm going to wind up saying that I'm going to put now the furnaces directly from a belt to lead into a wall assembly machine that will ultimately go into the actual military science packs. So let's talk through this new design and how I've reapproached it now. So here's the rework. What you're going to notice is there's now 3 distinct sections for each of these builds. There's one that actually produces the actual piercing round ammo. There's another one that goes and crafts the grenades. And then we have the final sciences setup. So one thing that I've done here is I've very much not over beacon things unless I absolutely have to. so that I can actually hit the target production rate that I want. But you can see here that the big benefit that you get from using a setup like this is that, like, in practice, you are going to wind up needing here, in order to craft the amount of actual, let's put it this way, the walls that you're going to actually wind up needing, you're going to need about 60 per second stone bricks that you're going to wind up needing in order to keep up with the 12.5, or in this case, the 12 per second of the actual walls that you're going to wind up needing. So immediately you're going to need 2 furnaces for that, because one furnace, right, no matter what you do, even if you wind up going and putting and max beaconing it, you're never going to get to the throughput that you actually wind up wanting. So put that there, and then let's just grab some stone, throw that in there. You're going to notice here that we can make 52 per second. So over beaconing this just to get one less furnace is just not going to work, because you're going to wind up needing 2 anyway. So for that reason, because you're going to just be using 2, like, just barely, in my case, I'm just like, all right, well, I just need to hit 30 per second per furnace. So I just need them just slightly higher than that amount, and then occasionally just, like, drop the actual stone input so that it's not going to actually have it. So you see here, it'll just occasionally get underclocked and not have enough. So, and that's because it's 30.9 instead of the 30 exactly evenly that I wind up needing. So the benefit there is that, like, you're not going to get it from one furnace, so you might as well, instead of over beaconing it, instead of having 12 beacons, we really just need 4 here. That's going to be plenty for actually producing the amount of stone that we wind up needing. And we can actually clock everything then here, and that's again here using the clock generator for all of this, where we have no wake list at all. And we can exactly output just the amount of items that we need to keep up and craft the walls that we actually wind up needing and keeping this nice and saturated. So this is convenient because you don't run into any automated insertion limit problems here, because we can put 500 of them in here, right? And this stacks all the way up to 100, so when you're doing a single swing here into here, you're never going to have a problem where this runs out of a buffer. So what that kind of means is that now we can do a very simple back-to-back swing of the other items that we wind up needing from this belt. You always see that this will pick up 1, 2, 1, 2, like this, and we just put in 1 at a time. This is incredibly stable compared to the grenade setup that I showed before. And the grenades benefit significantly from this, because now we can go and increase the number of beacons that we have around here to get to a magical breakpoint of 10 per second. 10 per second means that we only really need 30 per side here. So that means we can go down on the number of actual assembly machines that we have crafting grenades, and we can go down to 3 of them. So that means 3 assembly machines here. And this is still the same number of furnaces in the old design, right? So there's 10 furnaces here. If we go look at this over here, there's going to be a total of 10 over here. We've just changed now that they're all directly inserting. And there's really these are barely ever running, so there's, like, the amount of transfers have been reduced. And also on top of that, now the grenades can actually craft all the way up to the magical 16 items in here. And you'll see that that's constantly happening. So the clocking is significantly easier as well. So again, with some of the things that we mentioned on Vulcanus, because of this getting blocked so early, you do want to have 2 inserters bringing in coal, which allows you then to get to, because it's again like a 2-to-1 ratio, it's effectively going to get you around the problems that you're going to have of not being able to throw all the coal in that you need at a time. But this is also good for transport belt length, like distribution, because you can wind up seeing here that we're bringing in all the coal to the individual sections here, and these can just, for a burst, hold a buffer of them. That's why I'm using both lanes, even though I only really need 120 per second. Having both of them saturated like this is going to mean so that you can... this individual inserter on the bottom is never going to be choked out. So, again, all of this is clocked to produce exactly 10 per second, and you can see here that these are constantly always pulling out exactly 16 items. So it means that this inserter always is active for a very small amount of time. Sometimes it'll hold 4, sometimes it'll hold 16, it does not matter at all. So it's just that it's constantly pulling those items out and has an extra tick on the way back to basically pull those grenades out. Finally, this setup is not... I'm not ultimately super happy with this. There's a couple things that I haven't clocked on here, But, like, I've intentionally not clocked these, because this will always have back pressure. So there's no point in clocking these, and then I'm just clocking all the other inputs that actually have to go in here, and then just basically just pulling out exactly 16 whenever I wind up actually needing it. As you'll see here, this will back up occasionally, and then we'll wind up getting free. So it's not exactly perfect in terms of this clocking, but it's good enough. So the cool part about this whole entire setup is the way that I've designed this is that now you have a lead setup that you can drop down that has all the clocks, and then you go and grab a follow section, which is set up perfectly to overlap with this. And then now you have one clock here on the bottom, which is all propagated. We have one clock here that turns on for each subsection that has their own little clock enabled. And then that red wire sends all of those clocks over here, and we normalize them then to their individual sub-cycle in ticks. So 11,520 is the least common multiple of all of the base clock cycles. And so then you just have one clock here that can enable all of the clocks to all work together as one. It basically synchronizes the whole build into one, effectively the same clock, which is convenient. So, in other words, you can keep on pasting this now and keep on going up here as much as you want, and they all are going to be using the exact same shared clock, as long as you can get the actual raw inputs that you wind up actually needing, right? So, in theory, this is significantly better. I haven't benchmarked it, but I'm sure that it's going to be a lot better. I'll benchmark it eventually when we get to a military science competition, and I'll use that for that point, but in theory, this is going to be significantly better for UPS than the previous design that I had, so I wound up going and putting it into my actual base, and that's what you were just seeing a second ago. So those are my thoughts on military science, and hopefully this helps you out so that you can kind of, like, if you're going to be designing something, my high recommendation is to craft the actual grenades separately, along with also the piercing rounds, and then just directly inserting the higher throughput item, which is going to be the walls, and just utilizing this concept if you're going to be belting the actual materials. So here's that exact same build that we just demonstrated a second ago, but now in the actual Megabase. You wind up seeing it actually running, and it works just like it did in the in the theoretical world, right? So that's a major redesign that I did for military, so that I could wind up having a better design ultimately than what I had before, and I wanted to get rid of a lot of the silos, and ultimately I realized that I had overkill the number of actual inputs, so I have optimized it now for just the number of actual belts that we wind up needing. And again, as tradition, I wind up belting things from all over the map to actually feed the actual inputs. And because I want to dedicate an entire video to just talking about Aquilo, I'll round this up while, again, we're waiting on Research Prod. So to have all the ships running sequentially, that takes about 30 minutes for them all to be running in the field. I'll talk about my White Science setup. So White Science is significantly different than I had run in the past, so I've removed a lot of weight from this particular build. And I'm actually really, really proud of this new setup that I have here. This is for producing fuel. So I use this on both this ship, and I also use it over here on my producer for all of the legendary parts that I need across all the different planets. So these are my upcycler ship for legendary parts. What's nice about this particular design is I wind up allowing it to occasionally go and grab oxide asteroids whenever it actually needs it, and it can feed that in, but has a very simple setup using as much direct insertion as possible to go and recycle the carbonic asteroids and also the metallic asteroids, so that we always have enough ice here. And the system's actually perfectly balanced, even with the additional amounts of little bit of calcite and iron ore that we need for producing all of the ammo and stuff. As you can see here, I have a backup mechanism in case we get too much ice, but these have never actually destroyed ice at all. So that means with the circuit logic of balancing between producing ice here with the advanced asteroid concept versus the additional one here to just top up and grab a little bit of extra ice. What's nice about this setup here is you'll notice that because inserters always prefer to grab from the inside lane, they're always going to grab the ice first that comes from, in this case, the advanced oxide asteroid crushing. So knowing that, you really don't need too many circuits involved here. I have some just in case, just to turn on and bring out some extra ice whenever we run low. But then otherwise, like from a priority system, you're going to notice here that we wind up bringing the ice around these little block loops here. That'll go all the way around, but always will merge so that these inserters are always picking up from a non-moving belt. So you'll see that here. And they always go out on the outside lane to come back so that they can loop around and get back to the point where they're getting merged here on the inside of this belt so that they come on the inside lane here. So this concept is something that I'm using pretty much everywhere on all of these little like setups where I need to have a little bit of a buffer. And I've noticed that that's like a pretty significant like change than just always using sushi everywhere. And it's nice because then these belts and everything and the transport lines and everything completely can shut down whenever you don't have the need to be running this ship. So these are things that, like, ultimately a large sushi bus like this is still going to be needed. But for, like, at least in this case, when I'm, like, upcycling all of the individual asteroids for producing legendary science. But this is a pretty nice little assembly machine for crafting all of the actual thruster, like, fluids and stuff that we wind up needing. So those are some of the things that I've done. I really like this little design, and I'm pretty proud of it. I'll probably start using it more in other ships, because you can really just have a few dedicated asteroid collectors that can turn on and off just when needed, and produce and get the extra amounts that we wind up needing. And the reason why we're doing all of this, instead of just having a dedicated oxide asteroid chunk hauler, because like really what you could do is you could delete this, and that might actually even be better for UPS. I just have it so that I'm not wasting the amount of oxide asteroid chunks that we have, but unfortunately that means that this is always enabled and is always like looking around, which is probably worse for UPS. But the reason you do this is because you're going to be like all these asteroid collectors are constantly going to be like, hey, I want ice desperately, because ice is a 2x ratio of producing oxide asteroids, like much faster than the other recycling recipes. So as you're traveling around, and like the optimal one is to travel between Nauvis and Fulgora, which is something that I've learned from Conage, is that like this particular route is going to be the best for producing science, for space science, at least because of the ratios of what you're going to get. So everything here is designed at ratio for that individual type of science that are for the asteroids that we're going to wind up collecting. And then I'm using some clocking of the actual asteroid collectors to turn them on and off, just like so that they're not constantly scanning. So you'll see here that this is constantly just emitting a little check mark, just to like occasionally turn them on and turn them off. Now, the science setup down here, I have little dedicated areas here, again, using that kind of like inside lane concept here for the dedicated items. So in this case, the metallic asteroid chunks that are legendary. This is just using very simply like a latching lead follower circuit that's going to go and turn them on for the inputs occasionally when needed. And then these outputs are just free because they should be always constantly having back pressure in here. So they just turn on and turn off when they're actually consumed. Everything down here is clocked. So you'll notice right now that we're producing an exact 38,400 per minute, and this looks like it's kind of going up and going down and going up and going down, but the average when you actually look at it is exactly 38K400, which you'll notice when you're actually running like military science over here, there's that 38,400, for example, when you're actually consuming it at full speed. So this clock here just turns on and off, just depending on if we happen to have enough space science packs here. And if they ever go and we have enough that the entire system is set up and is full, then we will go ahead and shut down everything. And actually all these individual sub-banks will shut down depending on if they actually need to produce more legendary components or not. So that means that although the ship is flying back and forth, we can shut down most of the asteroid collectors, and you can see that we're hovering exactly at the 19,200 mark. And that's actually the consumption rate that we currently have on Nauvis when we're running research productivity. When we're running any of the other faster sciences, then this will go at max speed and will be constantly producing. But the nice thing is this is all clocked here now, which it wasn't before, to produce exactly between the two different banks the 1920, or rather the 640 per second that we wind up actually needing for legendary science. So this is the new ship. This is the way that I've designed it. It looks ugly, but I like it. So I've never tested it against other people's designs and things like that, but as far as the from what it was before, this is definitely, from my small testing that I've done, is more UPS optimal than the way that I had designed it before. So that's space science. Last but not least, let's talk about the hub. So the hub itself is like one of the most subjective things. Like, people will have different philosophies on how they wind up designing it. In my mind, like, the best thing to do for eliminating bot usage is to prioritize the two things that will always be normal quality science, which is going to be Gleba science and Promethium. Both of those don't really make sense from a UPS perspective to be anything but normal quality. So that's how I've designed my hub. So I try to pull out Promethium science as fast as I possibly can, which at max throughput, the best that you can get is a total of 8 belts out of this. You could do fully 16 belts of Promethium science if you wind up actually utilizing all of the slots around it. But with cars and with the actual inserters that are coming out of here, I've kind of done a balance of both Gleba and for Promethium science. Gleba is convenient because you can always then prioritize on these inserters, and if I can see anything on here, I have no idea how YouTube's going to handle the compression on this. Where is my mouse? It is somewhere here. There we go. Thank you. So you wind up seeing here that this can be set to spoiled first, and this can always then grab the actual agriculture science directly out of the hub. The bots are non-deterministic in terms of what they're actually going to go and grab, so you're going to wind up having different levels of freshness in these individual chests. So some things that I wind up doing is I'm a little bit more smart, because again, I have said, or a little bit smarter with this whole system, because I have a global system that tells me all the sciences that I'm running, I can utilize that information to make some pretty simple decisions. So if I'm running Promethium science, then I wind up turning off these additional requester chests, because there's no reason for me to go and be dropping science into them. If I'm running agriculture science but not Promethium science, then I do want those enabled so that I can have the full 240 per second out of this individual lane. So there's some small things that I wind up doing for setting the requests here to only be enabled when I'm running Research Prod or not. So again, like, holistically bringing all the things together and running everything with the knowledge that of the actual setup that you're trying to do, right? And you'll see here that, like, I have too many, like, inserters here for, like, the uncommon science, but it's also because I run both things. I run at half speed for research productivity, and, in other words, the full speed for all the other sciences. So I do need those extra requester chests, but trying to get them as close to the hub is something to go and optimize for, so that you don't have as much bot travel distance here, if you're seeing this right now. But even here, like, running this, these bots, there's some things that could be potentially optimized, and this is just because I already had the base laid out the way that I wanted to. Ultimately, if I ran this particular block here up for the top area and away from the actual base, instead of having it here on the bottom, this would actually optimize a little bit so that I don't have this longer distance, because they all come from the top left-hand corner, so going all the way down to here is not as optimal. And I could, in theory, bring a lot of these additional requester chests a lot closer here, and then just bring this up and out from the top here so that the bots don't have as long of a distance to travel here as compared to how nice and tight it is here on the top. You can see kind of that uneven distribution. The downside of designing a hub like this that is purposefully built specifically for the research prod that I'm targeting is that if I ever scale up, I'm going to have to redesign it again. I've redesigned the hub so many times at this point that I don't really care, but that's just something that you should probably consider if you're doing this. A big difference as compared to before, too, is because I have such a small consumption rate of calcite, I wind up just bringing these over to the side, and the same thing that I also do for the very little consumption of bioflux, those also come to the side with requester chests. Very occasionally do they actually need to have anything inserted into them, and they can go across like this. One fundamental difference is you'll notice here that I have an isolated bot network specifically here, just for, and we can look at it named, there is an export here of the calcite. And I have a very small bot network. There's about 200 logistics bots, and it's just all their job is to do is to distribute this calcite into these individual the chests that go to deliver calcite with the actual trains. So have this isolated bot network that way. That what would happen sometimes is occasionally if you got to a point where this belt wasn't quite fast enough in a burst to fill up all these buffer chests, what would happen is the bots would all create a huge wave of flying back over here quickly to fill it up and then go back to their normal task. I wanted to eliminate that, so just having an isolated network here means that they can just occasionally top up these trains whenever they actually wind up needing more calcite, and they can just quickly deliver them in an isolated network, and then they don't have to actually go and ever have these robots interact with this particular network. So that is the main core of the hub itself, and those are the main changes that I've made to more reduce the actual active bots here. And you can see that like the actual number of logistics bots, even though I have a lot in the network, I'm only using about 1,000 actual bots while I'm running research prod, which is pretty nice. That's one of the main benefits that you're going to get from running uncommon science everywhere. So now that we've been running Promethium science for about almost an hour, you can see kind of how that distribution function works of spreading them out every 6 minutes. You'll see the first one kick off, then 6 minutes later the next one comes out, and 6 minutes later the next one comes out. And it overshoots because we're only consuming 115k, right? So here you can see that. But eventually this will normalize and we'll get back to a regular cadence as the ships have to. There's going to be a little bit of a buffer when all of the science is dumped, but the key thing just to have is get rid of all the science, drop it all on into the landing pad, and then just go and start spreading out your ships so that you can quickly get to a stable point afterwards. So that's the main function of why I do that and how I've gotten completely rid of the token system, and it's made it a much smoother experience so that now when we do an actual transition, you'll see immediately that there's a small dip, and that small dip there is about 2 minutes or so for agriculture science to come back up and question us. I am destroying them at the end of the line, but that slight overshoot means you do run out of agriculture science for a small bit of time until it gets back to normal freshness. But 2 minutes when you're running something for 90 hours is a nothing burger. So you'll see also here, just as a small side note, you'll see that there is a slightly higher consumption of science here at this point, and that's because when I dump all the science out from the labs, they wind up then consuming, there's 4 additional labs that wind up consuming science, which is this bad boy right here. So you'll wind up seeing that this takes a buffer of all the other dumped science that comes from all of the individual labs, and then gets fed in here. And so those extra 4 make that slight difference where it's slightly consuming higher, and then it goes back down to, because it's consuming the buffer of extra science that we threw out of the system, out of all of the individual labs when we do the transition, and then it goes back to its normal paces. So it's almost a rounding error, but it's a very small amount, but you do wind up seeing it here on the chart. And it takes about 20 minutes or so for that buffer to fully run out from just having one lab consume it. But then otherwise, this completely shuts down it once we run out of all the sciences in this chest here. So, and that's it. So now this should be able to run completely successfully, and I don't have any more the issues that I had ever since I started like just dumping all of the science. Because it would wind up having it so that if you don't send all the ships out immediately, then you'd wind up having a period where eventually it would become unstable, you'd run out of science, and then eventually the ships would synchronize. I just wanted to get rid of that completely so that we can have a very nice production graph and then immediately just switch over and have constant production here. So that's one of the main optimizations I've made for Promethium science and delivery of the eggs and all of those wonderful things that come with that. So in conclusion, I've bumped up the actual FPS right now to run at 2x speed just so that we can see that we are well over the 60 UPS mark. And then otherwise, in the next video, what I want to talk about is 3 things. I want to go through the new setup here on Aquilo and some of the design choices and differences that we've made for optimizing both quantum processors and the actual blades for the Aquilo science. And we'll also do a deep dive on these Promethium ships, so stay tuned and subscribe if you're interested in that. And then finally, I will talk a little bit more in depth about what the future plans of this base are, because I want to talk about what are the challenges that exist when you're running these very small Promethium ships compared to the much larger ships that other people are running, and why you should be probably running those much larger ships and not these very small ones that I am currently running. So stay tuned and subscribe for that. Otherwise, my name is Abuck Nasty, and thank you for sticking around for all this wonderful info about the progress that I'm making, continuing to scale up this particular base. So, thank you so much, and I will see you in the next video.